The dust of Redemption Creek tasted like shame. Alara knew its flavor intimately, the fine grit coating her tongue, a constant reminder of her fall. It was the same dust that clung to the hem of her worn calico dress, the one she'd been married in, the one she now wore as a widow branded by destitution. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast indifferent sky, beating down on the townsfolk gathered in the square. They were a jury of weathered faces and hard eyes, their whispers a swarm of locusts devouring what little was left of her dignity. Her 3 children, small silent specters of her late husband's legacy, huddled behind her skirts. 7-year-old Finn, his face a mask of stoic terror, clutched her hand so tightly his knuckles were white stones. 5-year-old Maeve, her corn silk hair matted with grime, had buried her face in Alara's thigh, her small body trembling with silent sobs. And then there was Liam, just a babe, swaddled in a threadbare blanket in her arms, his innocent weight. A leaden anchor pulling her down into this abyss. They were being auctioned. Not like cattle, the town sheriff, a man named Jedediah Thorne, with a belly that strained the buttons of his uniform and a heart of pure granite, had clarified with a sneer. They were being sold into indenture. A mercy, he'd called it. A way for the town to absolve itself of the burden of a widow and her brood, left penniless after her husband, a good man named Thomas, had been stolen by a fever that swept through the valley like a phantom thief. The auctioneer, a slick man with a voice like oiled gravel, started the bidding. What am I offered for the labor of this fine, strong woman and her eldest boy? Healthy, capable hands for farm work, for mending, for cooking. The girl can be taught to serve. The babe, well, he comes with the lot. A wave of heat washed over Alara, a sickening tide of humiliation so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. She stared out over the crowd, her gaze sweeping past the smug faces of the merchants, the pitying glances of the other women, the cold indifference of the ranchers. Each face was a nail in the coffin of her hope. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had once praised Alara's needlework, now looking away as if the sight of her was a contagion. She saw Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, a man who had shared many an ale with Thomas, now studying the dust at his feet with intense focus. They were all complicit in this desecration. Her eyes landed on the back of the crowd, where a man stood. Apart from the rest, a solitary figure leaning against the rough-hewn post of the general store's porch. He was tall and broad, a silhouette of quiet strength against the blinding glare of the afternoon. She couldn't make out his features, hidden as they were by the shadow of his hat, but there was something about his stillness, his very presence, that felt different. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't sneering. He was just watching. The bidding was a low, pathetic affair. A few dollars for a family soul. Thorne himself made a bid, his eyes glinting with a possessive cruelty that made Alara's blood run cold. She knew what indenture under Thorne would mean. It would be a slow death, a daily chipping away at her spirit, until nothing remained but an empty husk. She closed her eyes, a single desperate prayer forming in the silent chambers of her heart. God, if you are there, anyone, please. The auctioneer's voice rose, going once to Sheriff Thorne for $20. A tremor went through Maeve. Finn's grip tightened, his small body a rigid line of defiance. Alara pulled Liam closer, shielding his sleeping face with her body, a mother lioness with no claws left to fight. Going twice. The words hung. In the oppressive heat, thick and final, this was it. The end of everything. And then a voice cut through the air, clear and steady, with the deep timbre of aged wood and solid earth. $100. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled, murmurs erupted. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, blinked owlishly. 100? Sir, did you say $100? The man at the back of the crowd pushed himself off the post and began to walk forward. The sea of people parted for him as if by some unspoken command. As he drew closer, the shadows relinquished their hold on his face, and Alara saw him clearly for the first time. He was a man carved from the rugged landscape itself. His face was weathered, etched with lines of sun and sorrow. His eyes, a startling pale blue, were the color of a winter sky, and they held a depth of pain that seemed to echo her own. He wore the simple, durable clothes of a rancher, his hands calloused and capable. He stopped before the auction block, his gaze not on the auctioneer, but on her. On her children. It was a look devoid of pity or lust, a look of quiet, solemn assessment. "I said," the man repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument, $100. For the family, not for indenture. For a contract of employment. On my ranch with room and board, and a wage. Sheriff Thorne sputtered, his face purpling with rage. "Now see here, Blackwood, this is a town matter, an indenture auction." The man Blackwood turned his winter sky eyes on the sheriff. The temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The town matter is a widow and her children starving, Thorne. You're trying to buy them for a pittance to work your own land. I'm offering them a chance. Is my money not good?" The auctioneer, seeing the color of Blackwood's money and the steel in his spine, quickly found his voice. $100 from Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear 105? Thorne's jaw worked, but he remained silent, cowed by the force of the rancher's will and the sudden shift in the crowd's mood. They were no longer a unified mob, but a collection of individuals, some now looking at Thorne with a flicker of dawning contempt. "Sold!" The auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down with a crack that echoed the breaking of Alara's chains. "To Mr. Caleb Blackwood." Caleb Blackwood didn't smile. He simply nodded once, a curt, final gesture. He turned his gaze back to Alara. And for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The noise of the crowd faded, the oppressive sun lost its sting. There was only the silent, unreadable question in his eyes and the frantic, terrified, hopeful beating of her own heart. He had bought her. He had saved her. She didn't know if she had been delivered from one hell only to be cast into another. He held out a large, calloused hand. Not to her, but to Finn. "Come on, son," he said, his voice softer now, though still rough around the edges. "Let's get your family home." Finn looked from the stranger's hand to his mother's face, his young eyes wide with uncertainty. Alara, her throat tight with 1,000 unasked questions and unshed tears, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only answer she had. Finn, taking a shaky breath, released her hand and placed his own small one into the vast, warm grip of Caleb Blackwood. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a silent one, a passage through a landscape as stark and beautiful as the man who owned it. Caleb had a sturdy wagon, and he lifted Maeve onto the seat beside him with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. Alara sat in the back, Liam cradled in her lap, Finn pressed against her side, his eyes tracking the unfamiliar terrain. They left the cloying dust of Redemption Creek behind, climbing into the high country where the air grew thin and clean, scented with pine and sage. The world opened up, a panorama of rolling hills, jagged peaks, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like a benediction. Caleb's ranch was nestled in a valley, a cluster of buildings that looked as if they had grown from the earth itself. A long, low-slung cabin of dark-weathered logs sat beside a sturdy barn, a corral, and a scattering of smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the cabin, a fragile plume against the immense backdrop of the mountains. It was a place of profound solitude, of a quiet, almost intimidating beauty. Caleb reined in the horses and the wagon creaked to a halt. The only sounds were the sighing of the wind through the pines and the soft jingle of the harness. He hopped down and came around to the back of the wagon. "We're here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He lifted his arms. "Let me take the boy." Elara hesitated for a fraction of a second before carefully transferring the sleeping weight of Liam into Caleb's arms. The rancher held the baby with an awkward but secure tenderness, his large hands dwarfing the infant's small form. He then helped Elara down, his touch brief and impersonal, before lifting a still wary Finn to the ground. Maeve, who had been uncharacteristically silent the entire ride, scrambled down on her own, her eyes wide as she took in her new surroundings. The cabin, up close, was even more imposing. It was a man's home, built for function, not comfort. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, the windows small and deep-set. It looked lonely. "The main cabin is mine," Caleb stated, gesturing with his head. "You and the children will have the old bunkhouse." He pointed to a smaller separate cabin a short distance away. "It's not much, but it's dry, and it's yours." Elara followed him, her children trailing behind her like a flock of nervous chicks. The bunkhouse was one room, smelling of dust, old wool, and disuse. It contained 4 simple wooden bunks, a small cast-iron stove, and a rough-hewn table with 2 benches. A single grimy window looked out towards the mountains. It was bare, stark and utterly devoid of any feminine touch. But it had a door that could be closed. It had a roof that didn't leak. And it was a world away from the auction block. "There's a well out back," Caleb said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. He had laid Liam gently on one of the lower bunks. "And a privy. I'll bring over some supplies. Firewood, flour, salt pork. There's a spring house with milk from my cow. You can take what you need." He stood in the doorway, a large, intimidating figure silhouetted against the fading light. He seemed to be waiting for something, but Elara didn't know what. A thank you? It felt inadequate, a pebble tossed into the vast canyon of what he had done for her. "Mr. Blackwood." She began, her voice raspy. "Caleb," he corrected her, his tone flat. "My name is Caleb. Caleb," she repeated. I don't know how to—" He cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "No need for thanks. This is a business arrangement. I needed help. You needed a place. It's simple." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her and the children once more. "There's a woman in these parts, name of Sarah. She's a Shoshone. Comes by once a week to trade. She knows herbs, remedies. If the children get sick, send word with her. She find me." And with that, he was gone, leaving them alone in the echoing silence of their new life. The first few weeks were a blur of hard work and quiet observation. Elara scrubbed the bunkhouse from top to bottom, chasing out the spiders and the ghosts of the men who had once slept there. She washed their few meager clothes in the icy water from the well, her hands turning red and raw. She learned the rhythm of Caleb's ranch, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. He was up before dawn, the sound of his axe splitting firewood a steady, percussive beat in the cold morning air. He moved with a relentless, tireless energy, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, working the land with a grim determination. That seemed to be his only companion. He rarely spoke. Their interactions were brief, functional, revolving around the tasks at hand. He would leave a pail of fresh milk on their doorstep each morning, a slab of bacon or a sack of potatoes. He showed her where the wild onions grew, how to find the patches of hardy berries that clung to the rocky hillsides. He taught Finn how to whittle, sitting on the porch steps in the evenings, their heads bent together in silent concentration. The only sound the soft scrape of the knife against wood. But he never entered their bunkhouse. He never joined them for a meal, though the smell of Elara's cooking often drifted across the yard. He kept a distance, a self-imposed exile that was as vast and unbridgeable as the valley itself. Elara learned about him in fragments, in the things left unsaid. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he looked at Liam, a flicker of a pain so deep it was almost physical. She noticed that he never laughed, that his smiles were rare, fleeting things. that never quite reached his winter sky eyes. She saw the worn, leather-bound book on his bedside table, its pages filled with a delicate, feminine script. One evening, driven by a curiosity she couldn't suppress, she had peered through his window while he was out checking on a newborn. CILF. She saw the inside of his cabin, a space as Spartan as her own, but dominated by a large, empty cradle that sat by the hearth, a silent, heartbreaking testament to a loss she was beginning to understand. He was a widower, too, a man hollowed out by grief. The community Caleb had spoken of was, for the most part, non-existent. They were too isolated. But the whispers of Redemption Creek had long shadows, and they reached even this remote valley. Once, a trapper passing through stopped for water. He saw Ilara hanging laundry, her children playing nearby. His eyes narrowed with a knowing, leering look. "So you're Blackwood's bought woman," he'd said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Heard he paid a pretty price for you." Before Ilara could react, Caleb was there, moving with a speed that was both silent and terrifying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply stood between her and the trapper, his presence a wall of granite. "You're on my land," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "Drink your water and move on." The trapper, after a moment's hesitation, had scurried away like a frightened rat. Caleb hadn't looked at her. He had just turned and walked back to the barn, the silence between them charged with a new, unspoken tension. He was protecting her. But it wasn't personal. It was a matter of property, of principle. He had bought her, and he would defend his investment. The thought sent a chill through her, a cold counterpoint to the flicker of gratitude she had felt. The arrival of Sarah was a welcome disruption. She was a woman whose age was impossible to guess, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black hair streaked with silver, braided down her back. She moved with a quiet grace, her eyes missing nothing. She brought with her the scent of the earth, of wood smoke and wild things. She didn't speak much English, but she communicated with her hands, her expressive eyes, and a few carefully chosen words. She looked at Ilara, at her children, and then at the lonely cabin across the yard. She saw everything. She taught Ilara which plants were for healing and which were for eating. She showed her how to make a poultice for Maeve's scraped knee, how to brew a tea that helped Liam sleep through the night. She would sit with Ilara, sharing a piece of dried venison, their silence companionable, a bridge of understanding between two women who knew the harsh realities of this land. One day, Sarah pointed a finger at Caleb's cabin. "He lost his," she said, her voice soft. She made a rocking motion with her arms, then pointed to the sky. "Wife, baby, winter fever." She then looked at Ilara, her eyes full of a deep, ancient wisdom. "Two broken pots," she said, holding up two fingers. "Maybe make one whole." The words stayed with Ilara, planting a seed of a thought she had been too afraid to entertain. Could two broken souls, two people shattered by grief, find a way to piece each other back together? The first snows came early that year, a soft, white blanket that transformed the rugged landscape into a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. The world shrank, the valley becoming their entire universe. The cold drove them indoors, forcing a proximity that was both comforting and fraught with tension. The bunkhouse, once a symbol of her independence, now felt small and confining. The children, restless and cooped up, grew louder, their laughter and squabbles filling the small space. Ilara found herself watching Caleb more and more, her gaze drawn to him as he moved through the snow-covered yard, a solitary figure against the vast whiteness. She saw the loneliness in the set of his shoulders, the deep ache of it in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. One evening, a blizzard descended upon the valley, a furious, howling storm that shook the small cabin to its foundations. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick and fast it was impossible to see more than a few feet. "Ilara," huddled with her children around the small stove, feeding it precious pieces of wood, the warmth barely keeping the biting cold at bay. A sudden violent gust of wind tore at the bunkhouse, and with a sickening crack, a shutter was ripped from its hinges and sent cartwheeling into the white maelstrom. Icy wind and snow blasted into the room, extinguishing their only lamp and plunging them into darkness. Maeve screamed. Finn cried out in alarm. Alara, her heart pounding, tried to shield them, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. And then, the door was thrown open, and Caleb stood there, a lantern held high, his face a grim mask against the swirling snow. He didn't say a word. He just strode into the room, his presence immediately filling the space, a bulwark against the storm. He went to the window, and with a strength that seemed almost superhuman, he wrestled the remaining shutter closed and barred it from the inside. He then turned, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. His gaze took in the terrified faces of her children, the fear in her own eyes. "Get your coats," he said, his voice a command that brooked no argument. "You're coming to the main cabin." He herded them across the yard, a human shield against the fury of the storm. He carried Maeve, who clung to his neck, her face buried in his coat. Finn held onto his other hand, his small steps struggling to keep up with Caleb's long strides. Alara, with Liam clutched tightly to her chest, followed in his wake, the path he forged through the deep snow a lifeline in the chaos. The main cabin was a haven of warmth and light. A fire roared in the large stone hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else. Something that felt like home. Caleb settled them before the fire, wrapping the children in thick wool blankets. He then went to the stove and returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee for himself and Alara, and 3 smaller mugs of warm, sweetened milk for the children. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The storm that raged without seemed to emphasize the peace within. The children, their fear forgotten, soon fell asleep, their small bodies curled up on a bearskin rug before the hearth. Alara watched Caleb as he stared into the flames, his face etched with a profound sadness. She saw the empty cradle in the corner, and her heart ached for him, for the wife and child he had lost in this very cabin. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "No need," he said, his standard reply, but this time it sounded different. Less like a dismissal, more like a habit. "Your husband." "Thomas," he began, his voice hesitant, as if he were treading on sacred ground. "What was he like?" The question surprised her. No one had asked her about Thomas. They had only seen him as a burden she was left with. A tear she didn't know she had been holding back slipped down her cheek. "He was a good man," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He was kind. He had a laugh that could make the sun come out on a cloudy day. He loved the children. He would have done anything for them." She told him about their life before, the small joys, the shared dreams, the love that had been the bedrock of her world. And as she spoke, she realized she wasn't just talking to Caleb. She was talking to herself, letting go of a grief she had held so tightly it had almost suffocated her. When she finished, the cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a silence filled with shared sorrow, with a nascent understanding. Caleb looked at the sleeping children, then at her. "My wife's name was Mary," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. She was everything. We were expecting a son. We were going to name him Samuel," he pointed to the cradle. "I made that for him." The simple, unadorned confession was more powerful than any flowery speech. It was a glimpse into the vast, empty space in his heart, a space that mirrored her own. They were 2 broken pots, just as Sarah had said. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, surrounded by sleeping children and the ghosts of their pasts, a tiny, fragile crack of light appeared in the darkness that had enveloped them both. The storm passed, leaving the world pristine and silent, draped in a thick mantle of white. But something had shifted between them, a subtle realignment of the atoms in their small universe. The wall of silence that had separated them had been breached. They started talking more, their conversations no longer limited to the practicalities of ranch life. He told her about his dream of building a herd of the finest cattle in the territory. She told him about her love of reading, a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in years. He discovered she had a quick mind for numbers, and soon she was helping him with the ranch's accounts, her neat handwriting filling the pages of his ledger. She, in turn, discovered he had a surprisingly gentle touch with the animals, that he could calm a spooked horse with a soft word and a steady hand. The children, sensing the change, began to blossom. Finn, no longer so wary, followed Caleb everywhere, mimicking his long strides, asking endless questions about the ranch and the animals. Maeve, her natural effervescence returning, would bring Caleb bouquets of imaginary flowers, her laughter echoing in the quiet valley. And Liam, the baby, would gurgle and coo whenever Caleb entered the room, his small arms reaching for the big, quiet man who had become a constant presence in his life. One afternoon, Caleb came back from a trip to Redemption Creek with a large, carefully wrapped parcel. He handed it to Ilara, a flush on his weathered cheeks. "I saw this in the general store," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "I thought you might like it." Inside the parcel was a bolt of soft blue wool, the color of a summer sky, and tucked within its folds was a book. Jane Eyre. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It was an extravagance, a luxury she hadn't dared to dream of. But it was more than that. It was a gift that said he saw her, not just as a worker, not just as a mother, but as a woman who loved stories. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat by the fire in the main cabin, the new wool draped over her lap, and began to read aloud. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the story of the lonely governess and the brooding Mr. Rochester. Caleb sat across from her, ostensibly mending a piece of harness, but she knew he was listening, his hands still, his gaze fixed on the fire. They were building something new, something fragile and unnamed, in the quiet solitude of the valley. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper. It was trust. It was companionship. It was the slow, tentative healing of two broken hearts. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. The spring thaw brought with it not just new life, but old troubles. Sheriff Thorne had not forgiven Caleb for the public humiliation, nor had he given up on his desire to possess what he now saw as Caleb's property. He arrived one sunny afternoon, a legal document in his hand and a smug, triumphant look on his face. He was accompanied by a circuit judge, a weaselly man with shifty eyes and a stained cravat. "Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false civility, "a complaint has been filed with the court. It seems there are concerns about the welfare of these children." Ilara's blood ran cold. She stepped out of the bunkhouse, her children instinctively gathering behind her. Caleb came out of the barn, his face grim, his eyes like chips of ice. "What complaint?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously calm. "A complaint from concerned citizens," Thorne said, waving the document. "It alleges that these children are living in an unsuitable environment with an unmarried man of questionable character. It states that they are being denied a proper Christian upbringing." The judge cleared his throat. "The law is clear, Mr. Blackwood. In the absence of a legal guardian, the court must act in the best interests of the children. A hearing has been set for next week. The court will determine who should have custody." Custody. The word was a death knell. They were going to take her children away. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with terror. She saw not just anger in his face, but a fierce, protective rage that mirrored her own. "You have no right," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "They are under my protection. They have a home here." "A home?" Thorne scoffed. "You call that hovel a home? And what protection can you offer? You are not their father. You are not her husband. In the eyes of the law, you are nothing to them." The words were a deliberate, calculated cruelty, designed to strike at the very heart of the fragile world they had built, and they succeeded. The space between Caleb and Ilara, a space that had been slowly filling with warmth and trust, was suddenly a vast, empty chasm. Thorne was right. They were nothing to each other. Not in any way the world would recognize or respect. The week leading up to the hearing was a living nightmare. The peace of the valley was shattered, replaced by annoying anxiety that permeated every moment. Ilara couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She watched her children playing, their innocent laughter a heartbreaking counterpoint to the terror that gripped her heart. What if she lost them? The thought was unbearable, a gaping wound that threatened to swallow her whole. Caleb was a storm cloud of controlled fury. He rode out every day, seeking legal advice, trying to find a way to fight Thorne's malicious attack. He returned each evening, his face etched with a deeper frustration, a growing despair. The law was on Thorne's side. He was the sheriff. He had the judge in his pocket. They were a rancher and a bought woman. They had no standing. The night before the hearing, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the ranch. The children were asleep, blissfully unaware of the precipice on which their lives teetered. Ilara sat by the cold hearth in the bunkhouse, her hands twisting in her lap. She felt a familiar despair creeping back in, the same hopelessness she had felt on the auction block. She had been a fool to think she could escape her fate, a fool to believe in the kindness of a stranger. The door to the bunkhouse opened, and Caleb stood there. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "Ilara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. She looked up at him, her eyes full of unshed tears. "There's no hope, is there?" She whispered. "He's going to win. He's going to take them." Caleb was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but it held a new, unwavering resolve. "There is one way," he said, "one way to show the court that this is a family, that these children have a father, that you have a husband." Ilara stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. She didn't dare to breathe, didn't dare to hope. "Marry me, Ilara," Caleb said, the words stark and unadorned in the quiet darkness. "Marry me tomorrow, before the hearing. Stand up in that courtroom not as my hired help, but as my wife." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a romantic proposal. It was a desperate, strategic move, a last defiant stand against a world that sought to tear them apart. It was a choice born of necessity, of a shared desire to protect the children who had become the center of their universe. Ilara looked at this quiet, broken man who had saved her from one kind of hell, only to be plunged into another with her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the ghosts of his past that still haunted him. And she saw something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. She saw a deep, abiding goodness, a fierce loyalty, a strength that went beyond the physical. She thought of her children, of their laughter, of the way they had begun to heal in this valley. She thought of the life they were building, a life of quiet dignity and hard-won peace. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was the only way. "Yes," she whispered, the word of fragile promise in the vast, silent night. "Yes, I'll marry you." The courtroom in Redemption Creek was packed. The same faces that had watched her humiliation on the auction block were now here to witness her final judgment. The air was thick with gossip and speculation, a toxic miasma of self-righteous piety. Sheriff Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table, a smug, predatory smile on his face. The judge looked bored, impatient, as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion. Ilara sat beside Caleb, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She wore her old calico dress, the only one she had, but she had mended it carefully, and her hair was neatly braided. Caleb wore his best shirt, his face scrubbed clean, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. Her children sat on a bench. Behind them, looked after by Sarah, who had appeared that morning as if summoned by some unseen force, her presence a silent, steadying source of strength. The judge called the hearing to order, his voice droning on about the court's duty to protect the innocent. Thorne's lawyer, a man with a voice like a rusty hinge, began his case, painting a lurid picture of Ilara's destitution and Caleb's supposed moral failings. He called witnesses, townsfolk who spoke of Caleb's reclusiveness, his unnatural solitude, his inappropriate living arrangement with a widow and her children. It was a character assassination, a slow, methodical dismantling of their lives. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. It was happening again. The public shaming, the stripping away of her dignity. She felt Caleb's hand cover hers, his grip firm and steady. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw not despair, but a burning, defiant fire. When it was their turn, Caleb stood up. He didn't have a lawyer. He would speak for himself. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent courtroom. "Sheriff Thorne has told you a story about a lonely man and a desperate woman. He has tried to paint a picture of depravity and neglect, but he has not told you the truth." He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had judged him, who had judged her. "The truth is, I am a lonely man. I lost my wife and my child, and a part of me died with them. And the truth is, Ilara is a woman who has known more grief and hardship than any person should have to bear. We are two broken people. That is the truth." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But Thorne didn't tell you about the healing. He didn't tell you about the laughter that has returned to my home. He didn't tell you about the way Finn is learning to be a man, the way Maeve's spirit shines like the morning sun, the way that baby Liam has brought a life back into my silent house that I thought was gone forever." He turned back to the judge. "He talks about what is best for these children. I will tell you what is best for them. A home where they are loved, a place where they are safe, a family to call their own." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "And to that end, Your Honor, I would like to present this." He handed the paper to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. The judge unfolded it, his eyes widening in surprise. This is a marriage certificate," he stammered. "Signed this morning by the preacher from Willow Creek." A gasp went through the courtroom. Thorne shot to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "This is a sham, a mockery of the law." Caleb's voice cut through the uproar, sharp and clear as a whip crack. "It is no sham. It is a promise, a vow, before God and man. Ilara is my wife. These are my children. This is my family. And I will be damned if I let any man, sheriff or not, tear it apart." He stood there, tall and defiant, a man who had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a husband, a father, and in that moment, Ilara knew, with a certainty that filled every part of her being, that she loved him. It wasn't a love born of passion or romance, but something far deeper, far stronger. It was a love forged in the crucible of shared pain, tempered by kindness, and sealed by a fierce, unwavering loyalty. The judge, for all his corruption, was a man who understood the power of public opinion. He saw the shift in the courtroom, the whispers of judgment now turning to murmurs of admiration. He saw the steel in Caleb's eyes, the quiet dignity in Elara's. He saw a family standing united against the world. He cleared his throat, a new grudging respect in his eyes. In light of this new development, he said, his gaze flicking to the furious face of Sheriff Thorne, the court finds that the children are in a stable two-parent home. The complaint is dismissed. The words were like a physical release, a pressure valve letting go of all the fear and tension. Elara sagged in her seat, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaping her lips. Caleb put his arm around her, pulling her close, his hand stroking her hair. They had won. They had faced the final test, and they had won. They left the courtroom and stepped out into the sunlight, a family. Not by law, not by a piece of paper, but by choice. The townsfolk who had once shunned them now looked at them with a newfound respect. Some even nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the strength and resilience they had witnessed. They returned to the valley, to their home. That evening, after the children were asleep in the main cabin, their new home, Caleb and Elara stood on the porch, looking out at the vast star-dusted sky. The air was crisp and clean, full of the promise of a new beginning. "Elara," Caleb said, his voice soft in the darkness. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "The marriage? It was for the children. I know that. I won't expect." She placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "It was for the children," she said, her voice equally soft, "but it was for us too." She looked up at him, into his winter sky eyes, and saw not just the lingering sadness, but a new, flickering light of hope. "We were broken, Caleb," she whispered. Now we are whole." He looked down at her, his gaze full of a raw, tender emotion that stole her breath away. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and future joys, of two broken souls finding solace and strength in each other. It was a kiss that sealed the promise made not in a courtroom, but in the quiet chambers of their healing hearts. Under the vast, silent watch of the mountains, beneath a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, a family was born. Not of blood, but of choice, of courage, of a love that had risen from the ashes of grief to build a new life in the heart of the wild, untamed West. They had been bought, they had been broken, but together, they had found a redemption more precious than any gold, a home more sacred than any church. They had found love in the ruins, and in doing so, had become a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to hope, and to begin again.